violation of freedom of speech, rights of journalists, and investigation of cases against those who attack journalists.
One civilian casualty is one too much.
Is this number also included number from occupied territories?
Monitoring mission has a field presence there.
Supervised situation in Crimea.
Repressions in Crimea are not decreasing.
Project mirrored for it.
Perpetrators are being brought to account.
People in detention or whose human rights are violated.
Critical voice, a very important voice to bring.
Hello, I present today a new episode of program Eurointegrators, and my guest today is Deputy Head of Monitoring Mission of UN in Ukraine, Benjamin Moreau. Hi, Benjamin.
Good afternoon.
Benjamin, there is a number of NGO projects in Ukraine who deals with human rights or freedom of expression. How do you coordinate and deal with these organizations?
Thank you very much. Indeed, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission cooperates with a wide variety of NGOs in Ukraine. As you know, there are a lot of NGOs throughout the country, and we meet on very regular basis to exchange information. Either we share information that we have, or we receive information from NGOs, mostly on the protection and the promotion of human rights.
Do you feel a hiding of information or some resistance from government institution about Human Rights Watch in Ukraine and the unoccupied territories?
And the Human Rights Monitoring Mission has a very specific methodology to gather information. Basically, in order to gather information, we speak with victims and witnesses of human rights violation. On the government side, basically, we have access to every place we want to have access to. We have freedom of movement, and we have access to place of detention. We go and we observe trials, and we can do our work freely. Basically, on a very regular basis, we meet with the national authorities, be with the prosecutor's office, with the police, and we discuss our findings and our recommendation, and we have an ongoing dialogue that is very open and constructive. When it comes to across the contact line, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission has a field presence there.
How many people are present on occupied territories of Donbass?
Both in the self-proclaimed Donetsk Republic and the self-Lugansk Republic, we have about, in the two cities, and in Donetsk and in Lugansk, we have about 15 staff members operating there that are documenting the human rights situation. So we have on government side full access and cooperation with the government, and we are also operational and operating in Donetsk and in Lugansk city. So basically, in government side, we can basically have access to all our interlocutors, and the government is interacting and engaging in a dialogue with us. Sometimes we would like human rights issues progressing faster, but as you understand, promoting and protecting human rights take time, and it's a long pending effort.
Yesterday you presented the last report of this year in Ukraine. What is the main topics of this report?
Indeed, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission produces a public report every 3 months. I have to say that a number of issues haven't changed. For instance, the question of accountability. There are still impunity for human rights violation in the country, and the Human Rights Monitoring Mission calls for systemic investigation in cases of human rights violation. Also, as you know, we do document civilian casualties. Over the last 3 months, we have documented 50 civilian casualties. 16 civilians have been killed and 34% have been injured. It is actually an increase of 50% as compared to the last reporting period, and it is also a decrease as compared to 2017. So it is a positive dynamic. The number of civilian casualties is decreasing, but at the same time, one civilian casualty is one too much. One of the positive developments in regards to civilian casualties is the Ministry of Defense has set up what is called a civilian casualties mitigation team. So we believe that with this new instrument, the civilian casualties will possibly also decrease. So it is a positive development.
Is this number also included number from occupied territories?
So, as you know, the Human Rights Monitoring Mission document violations on both sides of the contact line. So the figure that I give to you represent civilian casualties on both sides of the contact line. Also, as a major issue is the impact of the conflict on economic and social rights. Even if the number of civilian casualties is decreasing, the situation, the economic situation for people on both sides of the contact line is worsening. One of the major issues is also access to pensions for people who live across the contact line. And there we call on the authorities to facilitate the process of getting access to pension to people who live across the contact line. Also, something that does continue is instances of torture. Over the last 3 months, we continuously report instances of ill treatment and torture on both sides of the contact line. Also, to be noted is the attacks on the civil space. I'm sure we will come back on this during the interview. But over the last 3 months, we have documented 59 cases of attack against journalists, minorities, and civil society activists. This is something that is really worrying, and we call on the authorities to, first of all, publicly condemn all attacks, and at the same time to open investigation on attacks.
By the way, what is interesting about, you mentioned about authorities. So first, we wanted to invite a second speaker here, speaker from Ministry of Internal Affairs, because they should deal with these cases. They agreed, but when we sent them official letter with the questions from the last report, where in the first topic was a topic about Katya Gazyuk, who later dead, they refuse. So we will not have authorities here to report about these cases, unfortunately, but we will have two civil activists. And I hope one is already with us, Vladislav Greziev.
Да.
Hi, Vladislav. So we are here in studio with Benjamin Moreau, Deputy Head of UN Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. And we were speaking about attacks on civil activists and journalists in Ukraine. I know that you are strongly involved in the process of defending them, and maybe you have some recommendation how to stand against such attacks.
Well, recommendations for activists, right?
Yes, yes.
I think first of all, everybody should be very pay attention to everything that's happening around, to see if somebody will spy for them, and to maybe somehow to join to the groups for reactions, to know that somebody will have your number and understand where you are in exact time. And this will help if you will be not online or will not pick the phone. You will have a safe person to react on that and to, for example, to contact the police and so on. If we are talking about self-organized actions, it could be the first thing. And then maybe somehow to trainings for self-defending, for understanding your rights, for somehow to check, to inspect the people who are observing you and so on.
You have some organizations who helping civil activists?
Yes, it's law enforcement organizations, people rights organizations, new initiatives who train such activists.
Do you have the last? Do you already were able to see the last report of monitoring mission of UN, which they presented yesterday?
Actually, I have not.
Yeah, by their report, it's 57 attacks this year, yes?
For the last
Yes,
3 months,
yeah,
we
yeah.
have documented 59 attacks on civil activists and journalists for the last 3 months. Meaning
3 months, 59.
exactly, for the period that covers the 15th of August up to the 15th of November.
Vladislav, your data is close to this number?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Do you want to say something else to our viewers or to Benjamin?
I hope how we will together work forward to this issue. This is what I could say at the moment.
Yeah, I also hope, Vladislav. Good luck to you and good luck to your colleagues, and thank you for your work. You mentioned torture, also in Ukrainian territory. What do you mean?
Okay, as I mentioned, we document torture on both sides of the contact lines. On a daily basis, our human rights officer go in place of detention in government control. And then also, as you know, we speak with former detainees that come back from detention in armed group controlled territory, from the self-proclaimed Donetsk Republic and the self-proclaimed Lugansk Republic. And we interview this person in government control. And there, people speak about what they have gone through in detention, including instances of ill treatment and torture. So that is something that we have been documenting over the last 3 months. So we have been able to document cases and instances on both sides of the contact line.
And you include description of these cases in your report?
And the instances of torture and ill treatment are detailed indeed in our report. So you can find all the information in there.
With as close elections are, as more important freedom of speech is. And what do you know or think about violation of freedom of speech, rights of journalists, and investigation of cases against those who attack journalists?
And the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission is following closely the situation regarding freedom of expression and freedom of the media. As you know, in our report, we have a specific section dedicated to what we call civic space and democratic space. And what we note over the last 3 months, period covered by our report, is an increase in the number of brutal, bold attacks against journalists and human rights activists. For the last 3 months, we have noted an increase of 31% more attacks as compared to the previous period. So our recommendation is the same. Basically, we call on the authorities to basically publicly condemn attacks on journalists, on human rights defenders and activists, and at the same time to open systematically investigation and to respond rapidly so that perpetrators are being brought to account. It is critical.
Can approaching election campaign in overall somehow influence human rights situation, not only with freedom of speech, but in overall with human rights, from your point of view?
And the Human Rights Monitoring Mission is following up on, as I mentioned, the democratic space. So basically, we look at freedom of association, assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of the media. And definitely, in an electoral period, it is critical to uphold all these freedom. As I mentioned, we have noted a number of attacks on journalists, but also on human rights activists. During the reporting period, two persons died. I would like to mention the name of Mikola Bishko, as well as Katerina Onsiuk. And it is again critical that in a context where elections are upcoming, that everyone can express himself and herself freely. And then if there are attacks on the civic space, that these attacks are being investigated. And again, that the perpetrators are being brought to account. Because if there is an overall climate of impunity, then that's an encouragement for perpetrators to continue. So again, the signal to be sent is perpetrators to be brought to account.
One more guest will join our interview now. It's Tetiana Pichonchik, is chair of the board of NGO Human Rights Information Center. Hi, Tetiana.
Доброго дня.
Tetiana, how much does your assessment of human rights in Ukraine coincide with the vision of your partners?
Наша організація працює на материковій і підконтрольній.
Our organization works on the territory controlled by the government. We also monitor the situation in Crimea, where the UN mission cannot work. Every quarter we have a meeting with
Кожного квартала зустрічі з моніторинговою місією, де ми маємо нагоду передавати інформацію.
the monitoring mission, where we share the information that we gather here on a free territory and the occupied territory as well, with the UN mission, so they would include the figures in their reports.
Your organization is also supervised situation in Crimea.
Так, у нас сьогодні, власне, через півгодини в Києві ми презентуємо доповідь міжнародної місії.
Yes, in Kiev we present a report of International Mission of Human Rights. This mission, they visited the occupied Crimea in September this year. They documented a lot of information. They held about 20 meetings in a 4-day period. They met more than 50 people, including relatives of political prisoners, journalists, human rights activists. They met not just pro-Ukrainian activists, but also those who supported the Russian moves in Crimea, and now they are under some restrictions and persecution, because some of them feel pressure for their anti-corruption activities. So we have got such a report. It has already been reported.
Вийшла доповідь, вона вже була презентована в Тбілісі, в Берліні.
It has already been reported in Berlin and Geneva, and we also plan to report it during winter session in PACE in Strasbourg.
What is the difference between information for human rights violation for last year and this year?
Ми бачимо, власне, по нашій роботі, що рівень репресій в Криму не знижується, але видозмінюються форми і методи цих репресій.
Unfortunately, what we see is that the basis of repressions in Crimea are not decreasing, but the methods and kinds of repressions are changing. During the couple of years after occupation, more forceful methods were in use. There were a lot of crimes committed by paramilitary groups, which has not been investigated by now. But today, they use so-called legal practices or methods. I mean, courts, police, which persecute dissidents.
Релігію, яка переслідується в Росії. І, зокрема, і сьогодні ми будемо також про це говорити на нашій презентації, те, як Росія систематично і методично використовує свої
Russia also uses its anti-terrorist and anti-extremist laws for persecution those people, especially those who are not supporting the occupation and those who belong to different religious groups.
Наша організація на підконтрольних територіях займається моніторингом ситуації з громадськими активістами.
We are also working in Ukrainian territories. We document increasing of attacks, violating of activists, especially during the last year.
Наприклад, у нас ми задокументували після Євромайдану близько 10
After the Euromaidan, we documented 10 cases of murdering which can be connected to social activities of killed people or to activities on human rights defending. 5 cases happened during the last year. We can see similar situation with physical violence and car arson. Unfortunately, those cases have not been investigated effectively, and more activists are suffering kinds of violations.
Okay, дякую. Benjamin, do you want to speak to Tetiana about something?
I mean, we speak all the time with Tetiana, and indeed we very much welcome the cooperation with Tetiana's organization that is critical also to protect and promote human rights, especially in relation to Crimea.
Under the influence of aggressive state Russia on the occupied territory of Crimea in Donbass, are there mechanisms to obtaining objective information, and are the mechanisms to influence and to help people in detention or whose human rights are violated? there?
As you know, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission has been monitoring and reporting on the human rights situation in Crimea since March 2014. This said, since March 2014, the UN monitoring mission didn't have access to Crimea. So we have set up a very specific methodology to be able to gather information. And specifically, it's what we call a remote monitoring. We have established a network of contacts within the NGOs that document the human rights situation. We have heard today Tetiana from the Human Rights Information Center. But also, we have established contacts in Crimea where we speak with family members of persons who are being imprisoned. We also speak with defense lawyers in Crimea. Also, we have a team that is based in Odessa that goes regularly to the administrative borderline and speak with people that cross on regular basis the administrative borderline. But also throughout Ukraine, there are people, Crimean Tatars, that comes to mainland Ukraine with whom we speak and we interview. So we have various sources to gather information that allow us to provide reliable and credible information on the human rights situation in Crimea. Now, how do we help people? I mean, we report every 3 months on Crimea in our quarterly report. But also, as you know, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission has produced so far 2 thematic reports dedicated exclusively on Crimea, where we give details on the overall human rights situation in Crimea. And these reports contain specific recommendations to the Russian Federation as the occupying power, as well as to the international community and to the government of Ukraine in order to bring progress and improve the human rights situation in Crimea.
In your opinion, introduction of martial law influenced the situation with human rights in Ukraine?
So the Human Rights Monitoring Mission is indeed following this development. And the line is very clear. Any restriction on human rights must be proportional and limited to what is necessary in terms of duration, in terms of geographical scope, as well as in terms of material scope. In the current situation, since the imposition of the martial law, as a Human Rights Monitoring Mission, we have heard a lot of concerns, but we haven't monitored for the time being human rights violation, and we do hope that there will be no human rights violation in the frame of the martial law.
Diplomatic departments of some European countries and US assess the legal activities of Project Mirotvorets. The appeals to Ukrainian authority to at least withdraw personal data of journalists, but unfortunately without results. You mentioning about the site almost on each panel we were participated together about freedom of speech. What is monitoring mission position about this site, and what is wrong they are doing, and what you want authorities to do with them?
The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission on Mirotvorets is very clear, and we have been reporting publicly on the UN position on this website. Basically, posting information on a website without the consent of individuals is a violation of the right to privacy, and then people who are being publicly accused on this website of crimes, this is a violation of the presumption of innocence. So we have called repeatedly on the national police to open an investigation to look into this issue. We are well aware that so far the investigation have not progressed. So again, we call on the national police to effectively and promptly investigate this situation. That's one. But also, as we speak, there are still people's names being included into the website. We ask individuals to go to the police and individually complain to the police about this fact. So again, and what is critical is for the authorities to promptly investigate.
Yeah, but you know that some ministers even supported the site with their words, at least.
And again, There are in Ukraine, in all parts of Ukraine, a number of human rights challenges, and we have, as a human rights monitoring mission, to keep attention on this issue, repeat again and again recommendations that we have made, and there is only one way to addressing this issue: to investigate promptly.
How has Ukrainian society learned, from your point of view, to effectively defend their rights?
I think civil society in Ukraine is very strong and its work is very commendable. Today we have heard two representatives of NGOs, and the work that they do to document the human rights situation in all parts of Ukraine, be in Crimea, in the east of Ukraine, but also in the west of Ukraine, is very important and very courageous. So I think the human rights movement in Ukraine is very strong and is very much developing. At the same time, we have been mentioning today that we are entering in an electoral period, meaning that human rights defenders, when they speak freely and they do objective and credible work, they may expose themselves to retaliation. So in this period, it is essential that they are being protected from any form of attack. So it is something that needs to be paid attention to, that human rights defenders, civil society are being protected in the upcoming period. And third, that is very important, is that civil society have a critical voice, a very important voice to bring. So it is very important that they are being consulted by the government, by the parliament, that anytime there is a policy being developed, civil society should be systematically being consulted and their voice being heard. The same with legislative initiative. NGOs should be consulted and their voice and their views should be included so that the government of Ukraine, the parliament, responds to all its citizens in Ukraine, that the citizens are residing in Sevastopol, in Kiev, in Vinnytsia, in Donetsk, or in Lviv. So again, civil society plays a fundamental role and their voice needs to be heard.
Thank you, Benjamin, for joining our program. Thanks to all who watched us. See you next week.